Morning, everyone. We will let folks join and start in a moment, and I'm also getting the presentation ready. All right, well, everybody, welcome. Um, we've got a small but mighty group, and we got John Mullins and Mark Forman who are going to school us on their thoughts on new federalism. So, John, why don't you introduce yourself to the group?
John Mullins, been in and out of government for obviously many years, as you can see my gray hair. Actually, entered government in 1979 as a presidential intern, the second year of the class, and put in 27 years in government, and then went to the private sector, returned as an appointee of the first Trump administration, and just left IBM recently. And that's really my story. Thank you, Robert, for sharing. Give me that time to share.
Yeah. And Mark, I know you need no introduction, but why don't you?
Yeah, good to see a lot of friends. Mark Forman, like John, started as a presidential management intern, GAO in my case, actually ended up spending about a third of my career in government and the rest in various IT and consultancies.
All right. So I am trying to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Good. That's the first step. Then I'm going to pull up these slides. Can you see that now?
Yep.
Great. So, guys, thanks again for being with us. I'll hand it over to y'all and um, we'll let you present and then do Q&A.
Well, Mark, why don't you start off and I'll add color commentary if that works. And I should probably say that the graphs in here or the illustrations you have come out of the white paper and they were to be illustrative, but they are not necessarily, um, they're just to be examples. They're not necessarily the formation of comprehensive thinking, but a way to give context to the text. So let me just say that as upfront.
And I'd add that this expands upon the article that Federal News Network published with us about a month ago. So the concept is taking a look at the organization of government, looking at how the regional structures are set up in very much of an intergovernmental model, including NGOs and private sector that all engage in the broader concepts for solving social problems and non-defense problems, law enforcement, social services, economic development, regulatory needs. This concept is taking a look at the fact that each region tends to have different issues, and you lose the flavor of the regional needs when everything's aggregated at a federal level. So we build on the increasing notion that public policy issues today, thank you, perfect timing, public policy issues today tend to cut across the programs and the silos of federal agencies. And it's not as easy as creating cross-agency goals or creating a task force. There are regional differences as well. And the delivery often happens at the regional level. So we want to tap into the fact that you have expertise in departments, but that you deliver the services working generally with state and local governments. And the closer you can get to them and give the integration by the federal level, as opposed to making the states or the local governments integrate across agencies, the higher productivity you'll see, the better results and more efficiency. And the only other part of the model that I think is different is that the requirements come from the bottom up by these regional organizations. The departments do the programs, those aren't going to change, but the creation of the programs, the types of things that they offer, the success of those programs are a result of the demand and the effectiveness at the regional delivery level in this model.
So I would emphasize a couple things that Mark said there that really are profoundly different from the historical past practices. One is the notion of separation between policy and execution. Two is that historically, cross-agency goals relied on cooperation and collaboration. This is really about a direct line of authority for accountability at the regional level for execution. And the second piece of this, which by the way talks about ecosystems and supply chains, not just federal, as you'll see in the graphs, but an ecosystems approach to integration using state, local governments, and public-private partnerships included, changes the way we drive change and accountability. So the regional directors would have authority rather than just asking for cooperation. Think of the difference between the Constitution and a loose confederation. This has the ability to drive change and hold accountable.
All right,
Yep.
trying to, there we go. All right.
So this, by the way, this graphic here is when we were first in conversations with the Trump team. They said, "Well, how will this work for illegal immigration?" So we put a graphic together because obviously this was a hot topic, but it's not necessarily. This is just a throwing an idea out. But you can see here that you have a regional director and you have supporting federal agencies. But just like the Tom is doing now, he can't do that with just federal agencies itself. He requires a host of other parties to participate in that junction. And I understand this is a highly controversial one, but that was the interest at the moment when we were talking with them about how would it work. But you could take this and use it for anything, whether it's economic development, you could do it for how to rebuild the shipping industry in America. You could actually do this around ecosystems, around the environment, around how do you deal with the Everglades, how do you deal with the Great Lakes as a holistic approach to harnessing the power of the federal government in relationship with state, local governments, and public-private partnerships.
So let me just contrast this with some flavor of the day issue. Social services between SNAP, aid to families and children, Medicaid. I would include the housing, energy, and labor programs. Those organizations have different regional offices in different locations. SNAP, now everybody's going out to a set of regional offices that don't match the Medicaid, as an example, regional structure. So part of the issue, I think, is going to be brought to the forefront by the fact that somehow we've got to rationalize the approach to regional delivery structures as the administration wants to move people outside of Washington. It's not as simple as saying you move them into the existing regions.
One thing I want to tell people, since I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the comments or the questions. So folks, feel free to chime in if they have a question. Any questions so far? Comments? All right. Next.
This graph here was just as in other words, how would you look at this in terms of structure? And one of the questions that comes up in this is, well, how would you get started? How would we make it work? What would the staffing look like? Because obviously we're talking about a restructuring and a simplification and consolidation of administrative and facilities and everything else associated with this. This was just an illustrative, what would the initial, if we try to pilot it, what would it look like? So we wanted to communicate that we were thinking through it, but we're not necessarily being prescriptive or necessarily have all the data. This is people on the outside looking in saying, well, here's a good crack at it as a first cut. We would need to validate this and think through it. But you can see how we emphasize performance and data as part of this.
Great. Next.
On the the IT side, the concept is very much a shared services model, but applied to service delivery, program results, and program tracking. So the atomic source of a lot of the information is this regional hub, and everything gets built up cross agency. So you get a different sense of what the performance is, but it's tied to outcomes and data closer to the actual source of where things are happening by getting this regional focus.
Also look at the fact that we're talking about the whole IT architecture is going to have to be rethought through, because what you're going to have here is basically an agreement on how do you collect and assemble, aggregate data across the ecosystem. So there's going to be a shared sense of data from federal, state, and local. And the federal side in particular, we're going to have an understanding about performance. Robert, you kind of given your life to this whole issue about how do you measure cycle time? How do you measure productivity? How do you measure cost? How do you measure throughput? So this whole idea of having a understanding about what those units mean, what the data sources are for those, so that you can actually have confidence in the performance of your systems. So business data is going to have to be universally understood and measured equally, which is kind of a unique opportunity for the government to start thinking across where consolidation and shared services will actually accelerate that.
So the benefits obviously are aligned to why we adopted this approach. The top one is how do you rationalize the services? How do you move from incentive structures that are essentially promoting life cycles of programs, generates redundancy in programs in different departments as a result of the congressional processes? At some point, you have to figure out a way to rationalize them, and we do not see the ability to rationalize the programs silo by silo, department by department. But by taking a bottom-up approach, I don't know if I'd call it bottoms up, John, bottom up maybe, approach on understanding the requirements and what's working and what's not at the regional level, you have a different incentive structure. The regional directors are focused on getting the programs that service their region's needs. The departments will still be focused on making their programs effective and in demand. But now, rather than relying on fiat and the strength of their relationship with Congress and so forth, I'm sure that's going to be there. But the rubber hits the road at the regions if there's no demand for a program because it's not performing. And by the same token, the rubber hits the road to increase the amount of program services for high performing programs bubbling up from the region. So that's the bottom up approach, and that's a critical element of fixing incentives and rationalizing budgeting and service delivery.
One of the influences of this idea was also an old book that many of you probably read called Thriving in Chaos by Tom Peters, who said that organizations in the 21st century need to be both loose and tight. So you see a concentration on being tight around data and data standards and be able to collect information in a seamless pattern throughout the ecosystems, but sufficiently loose to be able to recognize unique differences at the regional level without necessarily asking for exceptions. We need to be able to be loose and tight at the same time so that the services and this is reflective of the needs of the citizens at the levels or the locations for which they are present. So this is a unique thing is it's not just a single standard fits all, but within boundaries, we need to be flexible to be able to be responsive so that the intentions of the programs can be realized without necessarily having the rules and the procedures interfere with the achievement of the goal.
Next.
Yep.
Right.
So this was just one of the, excuse me, this was just a reflection of saying, well, how would you look at this in terms of measure? And as you recognize, the first thing we have to do when we start thinking about combining monies and allocating resources within the regions is that we need to respect the legislative and the congressional oversight and responsibility of those programs. They're generalized to using monies appropriately. So agencies, authorities, FTE, budget, etc., is a way of bringing these things together and concentrating on a monthly performance target that fits the goal that is actually measured by systems of record, again, around data standards and actually understanding performance. And this is not to do inspections 90 days, 120 days later, but to do this in essentially real time based upon the systems of record. So we're talking about digital auditing, digital compliance monitoring, rather than inspection. We design the quality up front.
Okay. Who's leading this one?
Mark,
So,
you want to take
yeah, it's
it?
a good question. Ron raised a question
Oh,
Oh, okay.
about countervailing this jurisdictions. Ron, is your questions in essence, you could have one region operating in a way that another region would not operate fully authorized by the court?
Um, uh, I guess it would encompass a whole bunch of different sort of frictions. The one I mentioned in my chat has to do with a boundaryless jurisdiction like SOCOM that wants to do things its way versus a CENTCOM, which has a more regional approach. And the two are inherently in conflict. And I guess my point is today we have more boundaryless issues than we have regional or state ones or geographic ones for that matter. So it seems to me that you've bought into a friction or a tension, sometimes dysfunctional, where the boundaryless jurisdictions rub up against the geographic jurisdictions and they have two different ways of approaching a problem.
Yeah, well, you're right. We have bought into that with the preference being the geographic approach to the solving the problem, while at the national level or the boundary list level, determining the resources and the programs, and this has got to be iterative. It's not like the first time through the program solving uh, opportunities or resources at the national level will match the aggregate of the regional. We anticipate that this follows a typical path of getting to an equilibrium that you never quite reach, but that
so go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't want to overtalk you.
yeah, but the way this has to work is continuous focus on results without the incentive of trying to keep a program alive. And the results focus is the region, the keep the program live focus is the boundaryless condition.
So I
Well,
would add,
sorry, Joe, go ahead, John. And then
I would,
I reserve the right to respond before Dan asks his question.
Ron, I will give you back the baton. I'm just going to say that as you, I think you've read the paper in full, Ron, as you recognize that we have to work with the tools we have currently. In the future, we talk about legislation having to reflect the new structure around regional government, regional directives, and regional deployment, but we have to work with the tools we currently have. And I think that you're absolutely right. There is a conflict that I think it can be realized. I remember at EPA, we had a way of blending general and specialized monies around ecosystems. I remember working in interdiction when we worked with across the intelligence and law enforcement agencies. And that's where that idea really came about. Where are your authorities? Where are your jurisdictional boundaries? You got to map these things because you have to make sure that you're in compliance with the law. But creative minds working well, I think, can find ways within the existing toolbox to move in this direction. You're never going to be completely integrated and assimilated until the laws change to reflect the structure. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess I would argue that I like the idea generally.
Yeah.
I particularly like the idea of departing from a default structure that says we're going to follow one size fits all.
Mhm. Right.
And it seems to me that you ought to take an ad hoc approach. That is one that says, in some cases, states are the unit of governance. In other cases, it's regions. In still other cases, it may be boundaryless. And let that vary by the legislation, as
Yeah.
opposed to trying to go from one size fits all this way to one size fits all another way. But again, that's just my
Well, I
humble
think that's
opinion.
practical, Ron. I think that makes perfect sense. And you see it, you will have a maturity model coming out, and I think it aligns so much with what you're thinking.
We've got a couple of questions. Denise, do you want to pose your question?
Sure. I'm just curious how this would work given the constitutional structure, because states and localities lack, for the most part, constitutional status. And if you work regionally, would you be working directly only with state governments and departments, or would you also just work directly with localities, counties, and cities, which has the risk of increasing federal power?
Yeah, I think you have to work through the states with the localities. I don't see us changing that. The only thing that we really change is that a state and subsequently localities have to go agency by agency when there's cross-agency service delivery opportunities. So rather than the states or the locality being the integrator for the federal government, we would have that integration take place before the interaction.
But in this case, so, federal agencies work directly with localities all the time today. This would just be giving them a central coordinator for those.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And John, did I see you have a question as well?
I do not.
John,
John Kaminsky.
sorry. You're on mute, John.
I think this relates to the conversation that we're having that Ron's raised, and that's what is it that's the construct for the selection of the boundaries? Because for natural resources, the boundaries might logically be around watersheds, but that would not work if you're trying to do a one size fits all. For say the boundaries you would select for veterans health systems around the country, or in law enforcement or something like that. So it is the idea that there will be a set in the 1970, I think, Nixon created 10 regions.
Yep.
And everything was organized within each region. And if you go back to the boundaries that were set in those regions, they probably don't work for today because population has changed, etc. But the boundaries tended to be artificial and look pretty on a map as opposed to practical use for determining, the delivery of veterans services or infrastructure or natural resources or air traffic control.
Well, John, let's focus on veterans, because I think that's exactly what we were originally our team was starting to concentrate on at first before we moved to ICE and others. First of all, it's not one size fits all in this model at all. There might be aggregate performance targets and goals for the nation to eliminate homelessness for the vets, for example.
Yeah.
Right. However, each region would be looking at their populations and trying to figure a way, how do we best do that? And I think that you notice that, first of all, if you're trying to eliminate veterans homelessness, it's not a VA issue. VA may have a lead, but you can't do that without the Department of Labor, because it's about skills and training. You can't do that without HHS because you need mental health services. You can't do that without DOT because you need transportation to and from. It requires a comprehensive approach. And then when you get down to the regions and the localities, it might actually be something you want to contract with Tunnels for Towers with. So there's a lot, the partnerships are going to have to be expansive, but you're going to have to go and build those relationships. You saw in the model here about identifying stakeholders and partners. This is about collaboration and coordination. And it's about focusing on building an inductive model from the goal, which is the top goal, inductively, as Mark says, from the bottom up, top down, around joint operations that speak to, and we try to achieve, optimality, not compliance, optimality around performance. It has to be compliant, with law. But compliance isn't our goal, results are.
Yeah. Interestingly, and maybe even ironically, the Federal Executive Board had legal authority to create these kinds of regions, and the the regional directors that were proposed in your model here,
Right.
and that the FEVs have been abolished. So
Well, and they were advisory, not operational. You know, at the end of the day, I think you're right, John. There are going to be some different conflicts in a regional model versus a departmental model that will have to be adjudicated. I think the basis of adjudicating those on performance from a national policy level is totally appropriate, and I don't think you'd want to get away from that. I think our focus is more on some of the discussion we were having with Ron and Denise. Right now, the states, for all practical purposes, are the integrator for the federal government silos. And while that may play out well, some of the states love Medicaid because they see it as a cash cow in a number of ways that have turned out to be perverse, that we found out about during all the debating over the last few months. Some of those types of issues will have to still get adjudicated. But the question of tracking the performance measures at the regional level and then tying requirements across agency programs from the regional level does create that kind of outcome consent and outcome incentive structure that that we think is key to rationalizing the budgetary process.
Shumendra, I see your hand up, and thank you for correctly spelling Bush. You're on mute. Right.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. Dan's in front of me. If he wants to go first, then I'll try.
Oh, I didn't see. I'm sorry, Dan.
That's okay, Robert. I always follow you or not, as the case may be. So the one thing I wanted to come back to is when John and Mark talked earlier about policy and delivery. So, this is really, you've got a lot of policies coming down, and we've all been in meetings with state and local officials where they get frustrated and throw up their hands because there's really no way to integrate them. And so I think the premise here is, policy is set often at the national level, and it often has regional variation in implementation. And this is trying to basically say at the delivery level, there's a much better proposition in terms of how do you bring together different types of services. And even in the Medicaid case, I mean, there's that state interest that Mark mentioned around cash cow, but there's also significant needed services that if you had a regional type approach could probably identify those more effectively and feed into that policy development with more data sort of at the ground level so that national policymakers have a better picture of what's happening on the ground when they're thinking about policy changes in the future.
It's a great point, Dan, and this is going to play out around the Medicaid, SNAP, aid to families and children, because HHS has 10 regions, SNAP and FNS have 7 regions, and they're not co-located for the most part. So it's each agency trying to reduce their Washington footprint to save money is creating additional complexity in service delivery at the regional level. We'll see how it plays out, but I suspect, Dan, you're right on target. There are going to be a lot of frustrated state officials.
Yeah, so my contribution is really actually aligned with what Dan was just saying. I put in the chat, a little bit about my experience when I served as a program manager for the information sharing environment and how the ISC was focused on sort of information sharing as a boundaryless problem and one that's cross domains of activity. And the ISC was terrorism related, homeland security. It was successful because there was top-down support, including integrating state and local voices into national policy. That was key. And I'm somewhat situational back then. And I'm curious sort of how this design would be accounting for, the bottom up piece, right? I understand you're integrating state and local agencies in the concept, but the rub always came to, do the feds listen to the state and locals? And Mark, you've talked about public choice theory and I don't know, almost every one of our conversations over the last 18 months. And that's exactly right. My experience was agencies were very parochial on domestic law enforcement and homeland security issues, and they all have a different view. And it was only when they were forced to work together and exhausted every other alternative, and there was sustained top-down pressure to work together, did they start to listen to the unified voice of state and local agencies and actually integrate that into policy. In the example you gave here, there's really, as I understand it, a fairly strong top-down, do it, a top-down view that doesn't really maybe have space for other voices. But I'd like to kind of get your sense on that. Not on the specifics of the immigration mission, but how does your proposal, bring in that bottom up into governance?
Well, I think at the heart of it is the data. I think you will know it's when you aggregate data at a national level, you lose some of the insights and the nuances at the local level. So by focusing with the states at the local level on the data, especially in the requirements definition process at the beginning of the budget cycle, I think you get to see a lot more of that nuance. I do think, though, is that, the heart of the proposal, as you mentioned, is how does the federal government work with states, and do they do it 25 different ways in every region or more, because bureaus and agencies within a department can often have their own regional office structure? Or do you have a regional coordination that does the integration working with the states? It's almost as if, Shemendra, you'd have a PMISE at the regional level rather than at the national level. And that's a good question. That's, I think the heart of Ron's question. Do you want both? Because some issues are national in nature, even with regional implementation. But I do think there's no question you need that regional framework as well.
And I would add to that, Mark, is I think data will drive a lot of this because it will bring transparency around performance and results, impediments and obstacles that bring objective conversations together over just preference and interests. So I think that would be very powerful. But I also think that we need to be mindful that we're talking about a transformational change in the way we think and deploy, measure, and deliver these results. And it's going to be iterative, it's going to be incremental in the beginning, but it has transformational implications. So we're going to be working with partners that are in different places and different structures. We're going to have to bring them around. Nothing changes immediately, but ideas have consequences. And this will basically drive things moving in a different direction in the future. You can see this on all change initiatives, whether they're technological, behavioral. There's a transition piece from the past to the future. And we're talking about moving from the past to the future. We're going to be in transition. We're going to have to bring something old and we're going to introduce something new at the same time.
John? We've deviated from the slide deck, John and Mark. Is that okay? Or do you want to get back? Let me know if you want to get back to it. John Comiskey.
Okay. This is the question about implementing beyond just a couple pilots. It's sort of like, what's your conceptual construct for doing? Is it solely presidential priorities, or is it some something like using the federal program inventory, which has a set of predefined buckets, or, so I'm just trying to get a sense of what it
John,
might.
it's both. It's both. It's administration, good governance is going to require us to run existing programs, but presidential priorities also are normally larger and more complicated than just a single agency. This is really about one-to-many relationships. You can't do this by just one agency. So the complexity of this requires a comprehensive and systematic approach around design and deployment and execution, which is more distributed. So administratively, as Mark was talking about Medicare, Medicaid, that's an existing program where this would fall into. But it doesn't necessarily, on presidential priorities are also normally things that, if you just listened to Eric talk about these yesterday, I guess it was the other day at the government executive thing, restructuring and the priorities that they have in the strategic plan that they call the president's management agenda, they're not functional. They're larger. And so, yes, to both your points.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Just, I don't know whether it's a question or a comment. When we created the Department of Homeland Security, we gave deep thought to coming up with a unified regional structure for the agencies that we were bringing into the department. But we were in such a hurry, we didn't tackle that, and nobody ever got back around to it because it was deemed too hard. I'm also thinking, we have loci of agency concentration that is the result not of deep public administration acumen, but instead political power, right? Huntsville, Alabama is what it is, not because everybody thought, hey, what a great place to centralize a bunch of defense infrastructure. Same with West Virginia. It's almost an unfair question, but this is really, this would be really hard. So how the hell are you going to do it?
You're talking really about the difference between the political and the managerial. Is that what you're?
Yeah. I mean, this is theoretically beautiful if they would just leave it to us, John.
The managerial
Everything would
elite.
be
The
great.
managerial elite.
Yeah, we know what's best for Americans.
That's right.
Look, let me just, I actually want to offer an example consistent with the slide that Robert shared, the third bullet. Knowing how Congress works, just a quick anecdote. I once conducted a war game for the new head of what was then Strategic Command when it owned Cyber Command. And the scenario of the war game was a takedown, cybersecurity takedown of the financial markets. And we spent 4 hours with various cabinet secretaries, and we did have cabinet secretaries at the table, arguing over their legal authorities and their budgets. Because every one of them had a piece of the action, both financially as well as legally. And the net result was Rome burned to the ground while these guys were busy arguing over Title 50, Title 12, Title 29, Title this, Title that.
Right.
And so, again, I do think that you can't default this. You've got to address it. And frankly, I like the tension between managerial and political as long as it's put on the table.
Yes.
Not by default, but put on the table. Let people wrestle about it, and they may get it right and they may get it wrong, but at least they're talking about it. Whereas today, it's a default.
Yes.
Well, if it's decided this is if it's decided that this is the approach to be taken, that this is the moment in time to get it done. Denise was talking about, adhering to norms and the law, which obviously is worth discussing. But if there was a moment in time where you could move everybody to this is certainly it. Denise, do you want to raise your point?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more how you see setting performance goals and targets. I really think evidence and, evidence-based decision-making approaches is ideal. But it's something that since the early 1990s, the federal government has really struggled with this, even when there's been different cross-agency initiatives. There's been lots of iterations of too many indicators and not being able to agree, and then just not the follow through. So I was wondering how you see this, particularly in the current environment, between promulgated rule of law, which agencies follow, and traditional civil service, which responds to Congress as well as the executive, versus the current OMB approach and the Office of Personnel Management approach of, the new rule on civil service that they're managers who should reflect presidential priorities. So how do you see that in the context of the current moment with the rise of the unitary executive theory?
Well, one of the things that we talk about here is well, maybe this is just a Mullins, not necessarily a team thing. I want to say everyone on the team agrees on this, but while we talk about budget, the government talks about a budget, but I always think about money as investments. And we have a different sense of expectations when we invest money in things. So in our goal structure, in my mind, what we're talking about is saying not aspirational goals, but we're to achieve a certain level of performance target for quality, cost, schedule, whatever, by a certain date measured by the following. You notice everything we talk about here is about performance-based. We talk about performance-based budgeting. We talk about objective performance measures. We talk about digital data elements, which will put up the indices that create the performance indices that we're trying to achieve. And there has to be a universal understanding and agreement among the data so that we are comparing and contrasting performance objectively across domains. This is a different sense of authority and responsibility that's going to be associated with investing for the American taxpayer in terms of national outcomes and performance. So that's a little bit different than what we've done in the past, where we say we need to end poverty. Well, how's that measured? Or we're going to need to improve health. Well, what's the caloric intake that's expected for every citizen? We don't get to that level of detail. So we're really talking about putting things together in terms of budget targets like you would actually expect if you were investing real money instead of just a budget. Mark, you want to build on that, or?
Yeah, let me
Yeah,
give
crazy.
you a slightly different
Okay.
vantage point that builds on that. I'm a big fan of the objectives and key results approach, which is basically, made famous by the book Measure What Matters.
Yep.
Having tracked this since we were working on GIPRA when I was on the Hill, and obviously the investment approach we put into Cone and Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act for capital investments, it took me a long time to understand people are okay agreeing to complete a task. They're okay signing up for workflow or workload type metrics. I helped 300,000 homeless people this year. That's not an outcome measure, that's an output measure. And we've always struggled with the difference between measuring tasks, measuring outputs, and measuring outcomes. I've come to the belief that we have to focus on outcomes. And the hardest part of that is to figure out which activities are accretive to the outcomes that we're seeking. It's hard. It's hard in the public sector and it's hard in the private sector. In the public sector, though, because of the things you mentioned, it's really hard. And when you overlay that with all kinds of biases that Kahneman wrote about, number one being Congress caters to the press or press worthiness because that gets them elected and it gets them money. And that may not be the appropriate allocation of resources. Cass Susstein, the former head of OIRA, and I think Dan, one of your former professors, has researched this pretty heavily, and there is a misallocation of resources in line with the press worthiness of issues. What I'd say about this model that we've tried to address that issue by having the regional executive focus on the outcomes, you break that model of focusing on the budget tie of how many outputs, how much activity did I do. Their focus has to be outcomes. and the accountability structure is holding the programs and the agencies accountable for feeding their outcomes.
And I think Mark and I are in a total agreement on both those points. The thing I want to emphasize, though, is objective performance targets. And what I find interesting is, and I've done this before. I remember sitting down with one of my former bosses in the government, who was an assistant administrator of agency I will leave unnamed, and we're having lunch together. And he said, and I bring up performance management. He says, "Stop talking about performance. You can't measure performance in government." And one of the things I reminded him, I said, you know, I have 35 people in your office right now doing the same work as your feds, and you're measuring the productivity and the quality of those 35, but you're not measuring the same standards against your federal employees doing the same work. So I find it inconvenient to when people say they can't do this stuff. They can. But one of the challenges, we need to reduce the cost and the complexity associated with measurement. And today in digital processing, we have the ability to do this without adding to the cost of compliance, and we need to do it.
Hey,
If I could give a shout out to Shemendra and Robert and the other people on the phone that worked on the Evidence Act.
Yes.
The use of key analytic questions. What problem are we trying to solve, and how do we measure? Have we solved that problem? Is key to this.
Yep.
Dr. Redburn?
Thank you. So this is very illuminating to me, but it does raise a question in my mind about whether it's skipping over one of the fundamental flaws in the new Federalism 1.0, which was that it designed block grants and formula grants and even the competitive grant system in a way that allows money to flow continuously over many years to places that are not performing well, and it has no levers in the grant mechanism, grant making or administration mechanism to encourage or reward stronger performance or progress. And it strikes me that there's a complement to this kind of analysis in what Paul Posner and I developed as portfolio budgeting. Like you, Mark, I would like to see it focus on outcomes for a few major policy objectives, and then to organize the budget process, much of it around the portfolio programs that contributes to each of those objectives, and to make decisions about how they could be working more effectively together and redesigning the way funds are are delivered. This means changing the programs. You say you want to use existing authorities, but this really requires, I think, changing existing authorities so that funds can flow based on achievement and to encourage greater achievement over time. That's a fundamental flaw in all grant making, as far as I'm concerned. And we need to think about grants and how we redesign them.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right on that.
Steve, can you shoot a link maybe in the chat to your paper? I had totally forgotten about that, but that is so relevant to this.
I think these are complementary to each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Steve, if I recall, the grants occupation doesn't have any positive education requirements in it as well. And it historically has been an administrative process focused on paperwork compliance rather than delivering results. In fact, they never asked for a budget or a financial statement for some of these people receiving these funds, so no one even knew whether or not they could actually account for the dollars they got.
Yeah.
So you have but interestingly, when I was working with the budget officers, the CFOs in federal agencies, most federal agencies, because of the limitation on discretionary dollars and programmatic dollars, have taken a different look at block grants and grants in general is primary mission money by secondary sources. I mean, they look at that as a way of trying to achieve their own goals. So you would think there would be increasing attention paid, even within the existing structure, around those things demonstrating value to the mission.
Mm-hmm.
We got to change it. You're right.
Robert, can I a couple of points?
Yeah, of course.
So on the grants side, I think, John, you're right. Historically, I think in recent years, there's been a lot of strategic attention to grants, grants reform, and sort of upping the level of skill set. And that's Dale Bell at HHS has done a lot of great work in that area. On the excuse me, on the performance measurement, I'd also point out that John Kamensky has done, a lifetime's worth of work in this area, and may have additional thoughts. And it'd be good to maybe get a group of John and Robert and Shmentra and others together to kind of scope this out. In that regard, I'll just note that, as some of you know, our center is going to do some research on this topic, working with John and Mark and others, and so we'll keep you all posted on that. The last point that I want to make was to Robert's comment about if ever there's a moment, it's now. I think that's true, but I also think that this is a very kind of bipartisan concept, because if you think about delivering social services more effectively, getting money into people's hands, think back to the conversation we had earlier about the HHS constellation. I think that this is something where there's definitely can be interest and ought to be a conversation that cuts across the aisle.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that it was a political thing. I was just saying at a time when traditional bureaucratic boundaries are dissolving, that you could actually, that as hard as it would be, this is a time when it would be easier than in, I think, a normal time.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Agree.
All right, guys, do you want to tick through the rest of the slides?
So this goes back to Ron's point about, well, let's just talk with the authorities first. Mark, you're the
Yeah,
if we go on here, this speaks to Ron's point about on the maturity model of how do you get started. By the way, we are supposed to be meeting with Eric and his team late in September to stress test this model.
Eric Euland,
Eric Euland,
Deputy for Management at OB.
Yeah, to stress test this model, and very much like what this group is doing here, saying, well, how does that going to work? How would that work? We're not suggesting that we have ultimate wisdom on this thing, so we need help. But I think that going through and stress testing the model against a presidential priority would make sense. And you'll see that in this model here, we don't get to the level of full integration or thing for years in the future. And there is a ongoing parallel conversation with the Congress to think about how to restructure or rewrite legislation in the future to be more supportive of this type of blended execution at the regional level.
Legal authorities, I guess, probably not important to tick through those, but we can share the slides afterwards.
Yeah, let me just summarize that by saying to get the pilot started, we do something very similar to what we did with e-payroll or some of the other e-government initiatives, and pick a lead agency, overlay the budgets and related programs from the other agencies, and create the interagency team in a region.
Right. Other questions? This is fantastic, guys. Thank you for promoting such a thoughtful discussion. This is sort of consistent with this, but I'm trying to figure out the agenda for the EOM panel going forward. And so I'd love your input now or afterwards. But I'm thinking about hosting meetings around functional management topics. So information technology, financial management, human capital, performance, just to talk about where we are and what it means for the future. So HR has been talked about extensively, and things have been blown up in that arena. The Supreme Court is going to answer questions about where the president's authority ends. Financial management, I'm not sure you've seen that the Office of Management and Budget has sort of blown up federal financial statement production and auditing. And of course, that it's a new era in IT. So that's my thought. Any other ideas or reaction to those? And I see someone put something in the chat. I didn't. Any thoughts on that?
Robert, I'll give you a thought on
Great,
AI,
great.
especially
Yeah.
with the new AI initiatives coming out.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you think about the generations of how we've tried to do data sharing and collaboration across the departments, it's been very hard because systems don't talk to each other, basically. Right. Okay, so in the era of large language models, there's a different approach. It's not systems talking to each other. It's these tools being able to use data from different systems. And in the era of dot-coms and e-government, it was about a technology called XML, which was data sharing standards. In the new era, the breakthrough is around something called Model Context Protocol, MCP, which is a standard that Anthropic created. And basically, it allows a large language model to interrogate and understand data with the mission that you've given that large language model. So the ability to work across silos and solve problems is a magnitude step easier if you use a large language model to basically ask a question, how many widgets do I need from agency A, agency B, agency C, or a very simple social services caseworker issue, which program should I use for this case? Which before was the caseworker tracking down and trying to pull together data and being the integrator. Now, with Model Context Protocol, it's coming to the forefront. So, of course, Amazon has introduced their version, Azure has, but this is kind of the breakthrough in information sharing, the next breakthrough, I should say, in information sharing that not just presents the data to somebody in government, but answers the question, the key KAQs essentially, at that transactional level. So I'm not sure of all the
We should just have a bunch of chat boxes run the next meeting. Right?
There are huge implications that need to be thought through.
Yeah.
What it means.
Let's build on what Mark is saying though too. This is going back to new federalism. Because by the way, Paul, I hope when you saw that IT architecture diagram, you saw some of your input and thoughts you shared with us earlier in our white paper design. So thank you for that, Paul. The
You mean Shemendra?
Yeah, Shemender, yeah. The challenge is going to be on these, if everybody does their own thing at the functional level, we're inductively building more complexity into the system that Marcus was talking about in terms of trying to bring these large language models together for data sharing and aggregation. So I think we need to be mindful. We start with what are we trying to achieve first? Just because we can make something more efficient doesn't make it more effective. So we need to start thinking deeply about what are we trying to achieve before we start spending dollars on AI just to do something in AI and check off the box.
That's the same trouble with automation, right? Automating the cow path.
Let's be intentional. The technology changes the questions we can ask and fully changes the way we can deliver. Let's just not be let's not go over and just pave over the wagon ruts.
Hey, Robert, back to on your question about the the topics. I think it's a good idea. I think it's helpful to not have it be a generic discussion around like the issue, but to think about like keying off a use case in each area that illustrates where we are, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities, so that, the conversation, well, why is this meaningful? Why are these management issues meaningful in a performance context? Rather than just sort of saying, let's talk about IT.
Yeah.
Because I think that you'll draw more interest from a wider circle.
Right. I'd also, this is not that relevant to your point, but I'd love to enlist a sponsor In which case we might have to align it. I wouldn't want to align it too much, but that they might have a specific interest. But given where Napa is, I'd love to be able to contribute something to the bottom line.
If there is or is going to be soon a presidential management agenda that comprehensively addresses these different functional areas, maybe we can organize along those lines.
Yeah, it's my understanding there are 8 pillars, so certainly would make it easy to fill the sessions.
It's doubled in size from Jason Miller's article.
Is that right? He said, yeah. Well, I think Eric Euland used his speech at GovExec last week to articulate 4 priorities. And maybe it's changed, but Lauren Stocker, I think, was saying it's around 8.
Oh, so
Not
4
too,
priorities,
not too many. Yeah.
8 pillars. To see a hierarchy building.
Yeah. Quentin.
Thanks, Robert.
Yes, sir.
This is maybe for a future issue. I think one thing that very few of these models deal with, and I think the priority setting is essential, and to have priority setting, what you're missing, I think, is civic engagement. There's a whole field of listening, understanding what matters most to people.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like Superman. I never see Clark Kent and Superman in the same room, and you never see engagement and outcomes and data in the same room. And they're both important, but I just think without them being integrated, none of this will achieve what we want.
I do agree. You know, having spent like the last couple of years diving deep into grants management, the lack of an intergovernmental forum in which to share good or bad is a real hindrance to the government's performance. You know, not until something really breaks do people scream about it. One of the tools, I was hosting a woman on my podcast recently from Popbox. Have you heard of this group? They're focused on tapping constituent caseload, the constituents who raise issues with members of Congress, as sort of a indicator of, or sort of like a risk map for where the biggest challenges are in the government's bureaucracy. I think it's got real promise, both fixing stuff and restoring trust in government, at least at that level.
I don't want to date myself, but I authored with a council of the House of Representatives, authored for the member of Congress I work for, the Agency Responsiveness Act of 1975.
You're in the right room.
Don't ask.
Right room. You're in
But it didn't pass, but it required that agencies read their mail and make sense of it to understand what people were really, what operational or other issues people were upset about with the agencies. It did not pass. Of course, it was HR 12348. And if you know how the House works, that means somebody threw it, like my member threw it in at the very end and it didn't get anywhere. But I think something like that, that's just the basic principle.
Yeah. All right. If nothing else.
Thank you very much for hosting us.
No, thank you for doing it. You enlightened us, and we'll look forward to following your path.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank
Have
you.
a great
guys.
weekend, everyone. Take care.
Thank you all.
Great feedback. Thank you.